Hey, Mate, does not want. Hey, Mate, does not want. Hey, Mate.
Now, when we were left in our innocence at the very early stages, when we were all tribal groups, doesn't matter what nationality we were, white, black, yellow, or brown, like, we all come from the same kind of tribal system. Like, we hunted, we fished, we lived off the earth, we had our own languages, we had our own parliaments within our own tribal systems, and then nationhood come along and wiped all that out and got rid of it and replaced it. But the nucleus of how those tribal groups sustained themselves was by their belief in God. So when man created the churches and they put all this dogma in place, they had to create this fear of God in order to control the man, so that they couldn't go directly to the Father any longer to feel wholesome. Governments dehumanized people, and then the church finished it off by taking another step, by cutting off their relationship with God, and by creating this fear around God.
About a time in our life when a lot of us weren't ready for schooling or understanding the new language that was coming in on us. School and candy store were the first thing that came to my mind when I jumped on the bus going to the residential school.
I was kidnapped at age 5 by terrorists. The church and the government, the RCMP, came in their gunboats to gather all the children and bring them to a house at residential school. 300 children arrived at the same time. We all went into this big hall, the auditorium, and Mr. Caldwell said, "Welcome to the red dustbin." That's what they considered us, garbage.
I recall being very happy and speaking our language fluently. Dad was a fisherman, and we always had food on the table. According to Mom and Dad, they threatened them, if you don't let us take your children to the residential school, we're going to take them and give them up for adoption. And they felt helpless, and they thinking we were going to be taken good care of and good education. It was very wrong. I was so confused that I thought my parents didn't love me, so they let us go. At an early age, I at the residential school. I contemplated suicide. And as I grew older, I said, how can a child even think about suicide? They called us stupid Indians, savages. They wanted us to speak English. So I lost my language. And it ruined my life completely.
If you wish to be happy all the day, make someone else happy. That is the way. Don't put your hands by your face, will you? Put your hands. Let me see how many can put their hands right on their desk nicely. That's nice. That looks better that way. Very much better. It's going to be somebody's birthday Christmas time. It's going to be the birthday of Jesus. That's right. And we want to be ready, and we want to have presents for him, don't we?
I was a bedwetter. And there was 3 ladies that used to fill a round tub with ice cold water and sunset. Almost up to my waist. They'd make me stomp on it for a good hour before I went to school, which I had to walk quite a ways in the snow, in the ice, in the rain, in the wind.
I was brought up by my grandmother. My grandmother warned me that when I went into residential school that I would be beaten for my beliefs if I spoke of it and if I spoke my language. And for me to be a survivor, she told me to hang on to my teachings and that one day I would be able to speak of them. And when I went to the residential school, I was beaten for speaking my language. I was beaten for not learning English quick enough. They didn't teach me English, they beat it into me. I watched my sisters being brutally beaten and raped by the priest. I know that Brother McDonald and Brother McGurdy raped my brothers. And I got beaten so severely, I went to Children's Crippled Hospital. The nun that beat me took me there, told me if I told on her that I would be beaten to death when I got back. So I lied to the doctor about what happened to me.
There's one time they found a note on this lady from a guy on the other side. They stripped her naked in front of a whole one dorm and the men there. This young girl, she was in grade 11. Her name was Sophie. We were wondering why she was getting so big. And here she was pregnant. And we heard her screaming around. She was in dorm 1, we're in dorm 2. And next thing we knew, they were taking her out to the ambulance. And when she came back a week later, found out she had a baby. So I went to Mrs. Friel and I asked her what happened to Sophie's baby. And she told me to shut up, shut your big mouth, you know. Some girls would I was too small to realize, but they would send them to the hospitals and they'd come back and they would cry for their babies. But it was the employees that had got them pregnant, and they never ever knew what happened to their babies. They were so afraid of their reputation that I'm sure they got rid of them by killing them and burying them just anywhere.
I'll never forget going to the residential school, which was called the Kamloops Residential School, and it was operated through the Catholic Church, and feeling so sad and so lonely of having to go into this institution that didn't allow you to visit your own brothers and sisters. And that was the hardest thing as a young little girl, not understanding why you can't go over there and give your brother a hug or give your sister a hug when you're so happy to see them and you're there and you're lonely.
My sister and I were sent to Williams Lake. I had another sister in Mission Residential School and then another sister in Kamloops. It wasn't until later that I found out that this was quite a common practice to separate family members, to send them to different residential schools so that it would break the family ties and it would break the communication.
And if you had a rough time, well, you do a better job. Some of you can't do any worse than your parents did. You should always try and do better.
I think that if we're going to have some reconciliation with the residential school, that we need to go to the top of those two entities. That the Vatican should be taken to task in the President and the Prime Minister of Canada.
I would like to see a suit against the Pope, against the Vatican. Why are we going from the bottom? Why is it that, given the fact that the Roman Catholic Church is the world's richest church, and yet they have their own autonomy and self-government as a Vatican? That doesn't seem right. That the churches is not taking ownership for what they've done to all Indigenous peoples of the world. We're not unique in North America. This same act of genocide has been common throughout world's history. As long as there's this notion of assimilation and civilizing of First People, and that our truths, our life experiences of our great-great-grandmothers and our great-great-grandfathers is just as worthy as immigrants who's come to this land. Through the diminishing and the invisibility of our truths, through institutional textbooks that only speak one perception of the history, it taints our dignities of humanity.
So we have to reestablish our relationship with God as we understand Him. And there are many different terms in Indian languages for that. You know, the Great Spirit, the grandfathers, grandmothers, Cheche Siam, it all comes back down to the same thing. Our drumming and our singing, our ceremonies, sweat lodge, fasting, all these kind of things are what make us strong as people. They're They're the simplest of things, but they're the ones that make us strong.
This is the place where they told us our culture was evil and the work of the devil. When I stand here, I can feel that evil. I relive the horrible things that happened to me here and the effect it had on my children and my grandchildren, and it's got to stop.
So the church has played a role directly with the government, because at first they were hand in hand, and the church was the ultimate power within each of these empire-building structures.
White folks and those of us who institutionally were involved in residential schools need healing as well, because this was a part of our history for which we now have profound regret. And very few people currently in the church were involved in the residential schools, but that doesn't absolve us from being responsible for that history. So we need healing ourselves, because we imposed our culture on First Nations people, and that's had devastating effect.
There was definitely an act of imperialism, an act of genocide, there's no doubt. When you continually hear the horror stories and the pain that many Aboriginal people have experienced through their different forms of trauma, of what they've experienced in residential schools, to me that's not a coincidence. It is not like the intentional good of individuals wanting to just civilize. I think that there was a real notion of wanting to destroy our identity, the right to identity for who we are and where we come from.
In 1947, there was a paper that was discussed, a white paper it was a paper that was presented by the joint parliament, the Senate and the Commons. And they commissioned a paper, and it was presented, and the title of that paper was Liquidating Canada's Indians in 25 Years. And in that paper, basically, it had said that they had failed in erasing our Indianness, right? So their attempts to civilize us through Christianity had failed. What people don't realize is that that for many years, Aboriginal women, when they started to have their babies in the hospitals, would often be sterilized. And the Canadian public, that's not real common knowledge.
I believe that the Aboriginal peoples of every First Nation need to kick and scream and do everything political and civil that they can to stand for their rights and to force our governments, and it's not just federal, it's federal and provincial, to right the wrongs of the past. But ultimately they have to go on their own healing journey, which involves ultimately forgiveness, but not forgiveness at an easy price. In other words, don't gloss it over, because the terrible, as I see it, the terrible tragedy, which I too was to an extent a victim of, have been, is that you give that as an unconscious inheritance to your children.
General Canadian and American and European society, I think, is also going to experience a real breakdown in their societies, because in many ways they also cut off young people from old people.
When the white buffalo calf came back in 1994 to the earth and was born again, it signified a time of change in Coast Salish beliefs. This time of change that we're going through has caused each and every one of us as human beings to look at ourselves. If we don't change, then very soon, like within the next 12, 15 years, according to the elders, the world will do it itself. Where there's land, there'll become water, and where there was only water, there'll become land.
And my father was in residential school in Port Alberni there. And he's told me, and a number of other people have told me the situation where it was in residential school, is that the church and the priests there, they favored Aboriginal people who would be complicit to their abuse, who would be rats, as it were, as we call them today. And what happened is that you know, they get treated well, if they're really complicit to these priests. You know, they'd get better meals than the rest of the folks in residential school. My father wasn't one of them. My father was one of the ones that got up there and beat a priest up. And so basically, it occurs to me that you know, what's happening right now with Mr. Phil Fontaine, he's like the ones that ratted out his peers. He's like the ones that were back there in residential school that pointed fingers at Billy Joe over there. I saw him stealing some snacks late at night. He's like that fella, because he's right up there with the government, and he's shaking their hands, and he's looking at them right across, and he's acknowledging them as a human being, and they have interactions as such. And yet he's not willing to acknowledge the rest of his people, i.e. the people that are here, as human beings. What he's doing is he's shaking the hand of I wouldn't go so far to say as a devil, but the institution that has brought pain and abuse to all of our people.
So I think there's God within each one of us that we can relate to, in that the ancient rituals are the practices that should be passed on to our children in order to make ourselves strong again. But in order to do that, we got to get over the fear. As right now they say, you know, if you, Catholic Church says that if you die in a state of mortal sin, you go to hell. Well, what the hell is hell? You know, it's like not being in the presence of God. Well, that's between the person and God, not somebody else who says that's a law. And so if a person feels that they're going to go to hell when they die, they get scared, and then they self-destruct. When they're in that mode and they're living in terror, they're controllable. And that's what oppression is all about.
From the Indian reservation to the governmental school, where they're going to educate me to the white man's golden rule. And I'm learning very quickly, for I've learned to be ashamed. And I come when they call Billy, though I've got an Indian name. And there are drums beyond the mountain, Indian drums that you can't hear. There are drums beyond the mountain, and they're getting mighty near. And when they think that they've changed me, cut my hair to meet their needs, well, they think I'm white or Indian, quarter blood